Today, we're joined by Edo Liberty, CEO and founder of Pinecone. Pinecone is a vector database that's raised over $130 million, most recently at a $750 million valuation, and they've really become a core part of the common set of tools that folks use to build AI apps. We hit on a bunch of really interesting areas, including the vector database landscape and how it's evolving, common barriers that enterprises have to building effective AI apps, and Edo also shared his thoughts on the infrastructure and AI opportunities ahead in the application layer as well. I think folks are really going to enjoy this. Definitely stick around for Pat and my debrief here at Unsupervised Learning. Edo, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
You were obviously working on Pinecone before this generative AI craze and, the launch of ChatGPT. And what was it like for you guys when ChatGPT came out? I mean, was it like immediately clear there's going to be some spike in usage, or when did you first kind of start observing just the insanity that I imagine followed?
I'll start by saying that vector databases, I think, are still vastly underutilized for a lot of use cases, for semantic search, for candidate generation, for ranking, for feed ranking, for like recommendation, for a million different things, right? When I started building Pinecone, it was sort of like a well-kept secret, a well-known secret, I should say, that the bigger companies like Google, Amazon, whatever, like use that internally for search, for recommendation, for feed ranking, for anomaly detection, and so on. But then educating the market was fairly difficult, and I would go to, investors and say, vector database, and they would kind of look at me confused and concerned. And
I'm sure they emailed you in 2023, and they were like, "We believed all along, right? We've always been fans of the category."
Yeah. Actually, I'll tell you a funny thing that the actual emails I got after that, but. Just to make matters worse, I had just come out of AWS where I helped build a product called Sagemaker, which was an ML ops thing. And like ML ops was like all the rage, before, AI kind of took off, right? So everybody thought it was building an ML ops product, right? So everybody was very happy to meet with me, and then they're very disappointed that I'm building something called a vector database. What is that? Like, it sounds like critically insane, right? And then with OpenAI, just kind of elevating the discussion to the broader audience. Like, the technology really hasn't changed significantly, to be honest. I mean, for practitioners, like, nothing very deep has changed, except for the fact that now there was a lot of oomph behind it, a lot of capital and a lot of energy behind it. And so it started being accessed by the non-AI engineer. When that started happening, we started ramping up so quickly that we started really exhausting whole kinds of machines in GCP and AWS clouds. We started really spending millions of dollars a month on our free tier. It was complete insanity. It was the entire team was dedicated to just spinning up more and more environments and just being able to keep up with the demand. I think at our peak, we started having 10,000 signups every day, which really pushed us to really think about scale and efficiency in a completely different way. Like we had to go back to the drawing board and redesign the entire solution, which later yielded the solution we have in place called serverless, which is maybe 2 orders of magnitude more efficient. But it kind of came out of just necessity. We literally couldn't handle the load. The funny thing is, if you want to talk about investors, right? I did have quite a few different investors write to me after vector databases have become a true category. And in some sense, we've already taken the lead. And they say they wrote to me and said, "Hey, I actually looked back at the notes that I took 3 years ago. And you actually said you were going to build this." And I'm like, "Yeah, because that's what I was going to build." And they're like, "Okay, that's not very common that somebody says they're going to build something, that they actually build it, and that actually succeeds. That's just not very common." I'm like, "Okay."
So funny. I guess so. I guess they'd all thought it was an ML ops platform, but then they read back through their notes and they realized what it was all along.
Exactly.
Was there a particular moment that you can remember that spiked usage, early on? Was it immediately apparent to folks as they were playing around with GPT-3 that they needed the vector database, or was there a tweet or something, or in the early days of that usage spiking?
I think one of the kind of moments that really just completely blew up. There was this open source like gadget called AutoGPT. That was this sort of like super like minimalistic, but sort of like precursor to something we would call an agent now. And it was sort of like a piece of nothing. It was really just like but I think even one Python file or just a handful of Python files with some like spit and gum and, you know, whatever. But it like agents do, it started like doing something potentially interesting. It was open source and so on. That thing just took off like crazy. And, you know, suddenly the people that started onboarding Pinecone were not systems engineer building AI platforms and RAG applications and so on. They were like the dentist that remembers Python from college and wants to play with AI, right? And then like things just completely went insane, like because there's way more dentists.
I guess a lot of dentists that remember their Python.
Yeah. Luckily enough that the kind of like normalized again, and the people who come today are mostly builders, but for a while there, it just completely went insane.
Yeah, it seems like there's a huge breadth of applications that are built on top of Pinecone. What are some of your favorite applications or some of the ones that really stand out to you? Obviously, we were talking about Notion before, and it sounds like Pinecone really shines for scale as well when people have kind of millions of vectors that they want to run workloads on top of.
So millions is actually the small scale. Today, when we speak with customers and they have millions of vectors, we say, great, you know, knock yourself out. You'll be hard pressed to spend more than $100 a month. Like you really are going to have to exert energy to try to do that, right? Where we truly shine is at the hundreds of millions, the billions scale, where companies themselves are SaaS and oftentimes sort of like software providers. Notion is a great example. Gong is a great example. Many others that actually they themselves develop AI, Q&A, semantic search, like deep AI solutions for their own customers' data. So they, like each one of their own customers might have 1 million documents, right? But they themselves have 10,000 customers. And suddenly they find themselves needing a vector database that can handle 10 billion embeddings, maybe across 1,000 partitions or 10,000 partitions, and do that incredibly cost effectively, right? And when you try to do that, especially nowadays where people really start understanding, hey, I'm not just playing in the lab, I'm building a true product, so I really need to care about unit economics. They want to figure out what's that going to cost me? And then we can come in and say, hey, because of our new architecture, because we went through this insane spike a year and a half ago and we've re-architected everything and now we've launched it as serverless, we can run this multi-tenant workload such that one of your costs for one of your paying customers on Pinecone might be $1 a year, like sometimes 50 cents a year, right? For a paying user, right? And then the unit economics really shine, right? So you said, you know, if you have 1 million, you know, vectors, right? I mean, 1 million vectors, I'm like, okay. If you have 1 million vectors 10,000 times, you really don't want that to be $100 each. You really want each one of them to be 50 cents each. And then that starts making sense, right? And that's where we truly shine, because then you really can operate this thing at scale.
On the application side, are most people running RAG or doing semantic search, or like, I guess what types of applications do you see? I can imagine, you know, the Q&A at Notion, that's kind of one, and then I can imagine there's tons that Gong is doing as well with vectors and turning videos into vectors.
Yeah, Q&A and semantic search are very large applications, very well understood. Chatbots, support bots, which are sort of like Q&A, if you will, but special flavor of that. People do legal discovery, medical history discovery, and all sorts of, analytics on that. Which again, you can think about them as flavors of search in some sense, right? There's a lot more that has to do with images and audio and video and anomaly detection and security, which is starting to become like a big thing. Pharma and drug discovery are, we see some applications like that. But the kind of meat and potato is really just the kind of text and images and search and, RAG over that in some sense. And by the way, RAG in and of itself is sort of like, based on semantic search. It's like the kind of the magic sauce happens at the semantic search layer, not at the reformulation layer.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess obviously, I think in the beginning, folks have used, embeddings for, it feels like mostly text data, and there's been, some in the image world. But I'm wondering, we've had different perspectives on this podcast about, how much multimodal stuff we'll see this year, and whether, I'm curious. You obviously have a firsthand view to it. Are you seeing lots of folks working with kind of image and video data, and do you think that we have the underlying tools required for those use cases today, or still expect it to be a text dominant 2024?
So look, I mean, I am, unfortunately, I've been in AI or machine learning before that, or big data before that, or all that, for 20 years now. And so I think I have a good mix of enthusiasm about the promise of tomorrow and a healthy focus on the problems of yesterday, right? Even today, right, with the advance of foundational models and, general AI and all that stuff, the average company still finds it hard to even like train any deep learning model at all.
Yeah. Like
anything, like a million parameter, not a billion, not 10 billion, not general AI, nothing. Like any model. Same goes to search and so on. So, I think we need to be very kind of realistic about what is possible, right, by the trailblazers, the research labs, and the technology leaders, and what is an actual technology that companies actually use, right? And those could be 5 years apart sometimes, right? So can we already see amazing things with multimodal? For sure. Right. Do I think multimodal is going to hit the kind of mainstream technology developer in the next year or two? Unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because you are working hand in hand with these companies that are deploying, and many times their first generative AI products. And so I imagine you do see these barriers or the places where folks fall down in being able to do that. Like, what do you feel like the biggest barriers today in terms of getting, these, training these models and getting them into production for some of the classic use cases that we're seeing around, support or search or others?
I mean, one of the biggest ones is hallucinations, right? They're not trustworthy, right? They just don't, whatever, they're compelled, they're large language models. They're designed to generate language, right? And when you are compelled to write a page of text on something you know nothing about, you will write a page of text, and that will contain stuff.
Pat and I do that all the time. I was going to say,
yeah, we've all been in like sixth grade, and I remember that experience very well. Like cold sweat. I'm like, shit. That's the mode we put these LLMs in, right? And so and then we're sort of like surprised that what comes out is nonsense, right? I think that's a huge problem. And I think that's something that we as a technology would have to, as a society, I mean, not we Pinecone, I mean, we the world, have to grapple with and really bring really good solutions to. I think it will start with AI startups and technology companies that build on Pinecone, build on models and so on, that have already know how to work with those technologies, building great vertical solutions for support, for medical history, for legal discovery, for, you name it. Like, it's a very long list of applications, right? And then I think 2-3 years down the line, you would see maturity in the broader market where now, like, every large company would use some of those tools, but would also use vector databases and models and, visibility and like a bunch of other AI specific technologies kind of natively for their own development, where this has become so commonplace, so well understood, so ironclad, and so well like ingrained in the developer culture that just people, whatever, there's just enough there that people just know how to use it well.
I mean, I feel like hallucinations come up time and time again. I guess have you seen what do you feel like the best way to, for folks listening that are they're also trying to figure this out? What are some of the best things you're seeing in terms of ways to get around this?
There are a few different really important efforts on this front. First of all, we are only now starting to truly be able to even measure hallucinations, right? To even know, like you can, for example, you can design a model. I can write a model that never hallucinates by just always saying, I don't know.
Right.
Right? That's not hallucinating, right? It's also completely useless, but it never makes a mistake, and whatever, like it never missteps, right? Okay, is this worthwhile? Like, should we celebrate that outcome? I don't think so, right? Okay, so you really want to measure kind of usefulness and correctness and faithfulness to the data that you were trained on, or the data that you have in a vector database to do RAG on, and so on. So that just these measures of even what is good is already like a very complicated question. And I think that there is another huge effort that has to do with, frankly, with RAG and with vector databases and with knowledge layers and capacities, and people grappling with, okay, how do I now make my data available to the model in a way that's secure, that is well understood, that is data governed, that, I can maybe delete stuff that GDPR told me that I have to delete, and somehow I need to know for a fact it's not somehow a part of the model anymore, and so on. There's a lot of work there, and that's, a topic we actually made a lot of progress on already. So by we, again, I mean, not only Pinecone, but the community starts to have pretty good solutions for.
Super cool. It seems like a Hacker News post in the making, an LLM that will never hallucinate. Just respond with, I don't know, every single time.
Like creatively avoid the question.
Exactly.
But we know, I mean, jokes aside, we already today can load all of but a good chunk of the internet into Pinecone as an index, and basically run like a language model next to it with, not incredibly sophisticated RAG, and already outperform GPT-4 like today. We've already ran experiments like this. So I think there's something there, and I think we're going to see some significant progress there, both on sort of like consumer facing products and like B2B products.
Vectors are the language of AI, or kind of what AI speaks, and there's this land grab to store them. Everyone wants to store the vectors, and because of that, there's kind of been this explosion. I mean, you would know this better than us, but there's been this explosion of startups that are going after storing vectors, but then also incumbents and folks like Mongo that are adding support for vectors. So how do you think about the landscape of, the startups that are kind of vying to store some of these workloads, and then the incumbents as well?
Don't get me started about Mongo. It's a company that freaking heard the word AI for the first time a year ago, and suddenly they're like experts. So, I mean, whatever. Like storing vectors, I think, is exactly what's happening. And I think you define it perfectly, right? People understand that now this is a data type, right? Next to my sentences or my images, I'm going to store a semantic representation of that object that came out of some embedding model, right? And that thing is a float array, right? It's whatever, like 1,000 floats, right? And if your infrastructure, be it like a non-AI technology, say that rhymes with Mongo, you need to put that array of numbers somewhere. And so they have to have that as a type, really. And that's basically what's happening there, right? And so, whatever, there's some work that has to be done to do that. That doesn't make your database natively be able to query those things and work with that data type at all, right? what people don't understand about vector databases and why they're so unique is that numeric array becomes in some sense the key. In some conceptual way, that is the primary lookup. That is the way you organize data on blob storage. That's how you load segments. That's how you search through your universe. By the way, that's how your own brain does it, right? I mean, this is an incredibly unique and optimized stack that if you try to somehow bolt on this like data type and like pretend that it's now a vector database, you're going to get incredibly poor performance and frankly run into like serious issues.
No, I mean, I think it's really interesting because I feel like obviously, yeah, a lot of other folks have come into the space, and I think generally there's been this question of like, what's the RAG stack end up being, and I feel like you guys get thrown around all the time as a key part of that, and I'm wondering like if you if you had to go to a company today and build a RAG product, like what would be your stack besides Pinecone, of course?
That's interesting. I frankly, I think a lot of people default to OpenAI. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't. We actually see really good performance out of smaller, cheaper, somehow easier to manage, sometimes open source models. There is no reason to spend a ton of money on that. There is sort of like an ML ETLing part of it. It has to do with bulk transformations and movement of data and so on. We've really started enjoying AnyScale's product, and we really like start partnering with them closer, and we're really enjoying their stack. We work with Vercel and others on kind of launching applications and building the kind of app layer. We partnered pretty closely with Cohere and AI21 and we're putting others like Hugging Face and others, like they're all in the mix. We see, I think, a good combination of those models, both for embedding and for ranking and summarization and so on. I really don't have a good vendor or a good technology for evaluation yet. Some people are going to write back to me that they're angry that I didn't name them, but I think that that'd be very interesting for a leader to emerge in that stack. I think it's very interesting, and it's very hard to do right.
And then as you think about kind of like Pinecone's footprint, I mean, obviously I imagine a key part of getting Pinecone to work in an enterprise is just having the data ready to be put into a vector database, right? And I imagine there's all sorts of, we've obviously met companies that are focused on that. And then there's, the metadata you apply to it. Obviously, then the retrieval methods you use to take it from a vector database. Like, how do you think about ultimately like the footprint you want to have versus you're like, I would love there to be a best-in-class vendor that's great at the ETL side and never have to touch that.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, by the way, I apologize to the audience. I'm like a infrastructure guy, so I kind of look at the raw machines and like very basic infrastructure. There are a lot of companies that are stepping into the embedding generation and data generation into vector databases that are actually doing really well, right? Unstructured comes to mind, but that becomes a viable option like very soon. And especially for specific channels, right? So if you have if you have a common data channel, say you import your data, say with Fivetran from Snowflake, and now you have that data in a table that has a unified structure because it's the same table that every Fivetran customer would have, then there are companies who would take that and transform it and feed it into a vector database so you can RAG over your, Salesforce, notes on customers and so on, right? And so if you understand that the data source that you have is like standard, then it's very likely you will find somebody who will have already built that pipeline and be very happy to sell it to you.
And you were talking about how how effective some of the smaller models can be relative to an OpenAI.
Yeah.
How much intelligence do you think will happen at the vector DB retrieval step versus at the generation step? It sounds like, maybe over time people are, they want to run on their own data and maybe you guys are seeing good results with that as well.
Like, I'll give an economics answer to this, right? The market's going to have to find like the stable point where there's a good trade-off between cost, compute, and infrastructure that you're willing to run and the quality of the output, right? We're already at the point where making models bigger on GPUs is not reasonable. You can run an experiment, you can flex and say, I have, 100 billion parameter model and it's whatever, it's like, does XYZ, but whatever, you're not going to run 100 billion parameter model for every API call on your platform. You're going to go bankrupt, right? And you're going to make the planet hotter. So like that's not going to work long term. And so people really have to find better solutions, right? Again, what we see is that with those models, if you do things right, sometimes the results could even get better. And even if they're not better, they're not noticeably worse. And you might be operating on cents on the dollar in terms of operating costs, right? So
Yeah.
I have no doubt that we would move there. That doesn't mean the arms race to whatever, like bigger, better models not going to exist. I just don't think that's what the market's going to operate with. Most of the market's going to operate with.
It is interesting. It feels like as these context windows were getting longer, these last few months, people were like, oh, well, is there a future for RAG? You just stuff, everything you'd want in a prompt. But I mean, I'm curious your thoughts on that. It seems like from a cost perspective, obviously, that if you're charging per token, that can get pricey quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that model companies allow you to bring in a bigger context, I mean, I think this is the least surprising thing in the world. That's their pricing model, right? Like, shockingly enough, they're willing for you to pay them more. What a shocker. There are multiple problems with it. Not only is it slow and expensive, it doesn't actually help more often than not, right? And finally, it just runs out of steam, right? You can say, hey, whatever, like, write me a job description, and here's an example job description to go off of. Great, that's great for a context window, right? If here are 10 job descriptions to go off of, okay, that also works. Here are 1 million job descriptions to go off of, okay, it's not going to work, right? Or whatever, write something and then get information from the web or get information from all of my documentation ever, right? That just doesn't work. I mean, think about that, sending all your company data to OpenAI on every query. That clearly is not the right thing.
Totally. I mean, it makes all the more sense as you focus on these perfect use cases for Pinecone that are hundreds of millions of vectors. It's like those are exactly the ones that would never make any sense to stuff in a context window.
Yeah, but even at the small scale, I want to paint the extreme because that's where it becomes almost farcical, obviously impossible, right? But even when you can create put 100,000 tokens in a context window, I mean, putting those documents in a vector database, you might be able to send, instead of 100,000, you'd be able to send 10,000, and that'd be just as good, if not better. 3,000, and you'd be paying 10% and not lose any performance. So why not, right? And so again, even small cases where the context engine is theoretically workable, even then, it's very rarely the best solution in terms of cost and performance.
Totally. And I guess just generally, as you think about how folks are using Pinecone today, does it feel like there's, folks have relatively standardized around the embeddings models they use or retrieval methods? Or one thing I'm always curious about is whether, it feels like in the limit, there will be, different retrieval methods for different use cases and different embedding models that are particularly good for, different industries. And it's hard to tell from the outside how much of that is happening today versus like, hey, let's just try and get this thing to work, and use. But I'm curious what you're seeing.
Frankly, most companies are trying to get this to work, right? Very few companies have done it long enough and have like really gotten the experience with it that they really start to now iterate over the embedding models and the retrieval and the re-ranking and the filtering and like really get very deep in the application stack and figure out how to build this. And I think we're getting there. It's a part of the maturity in the market, like in the same way that any search or recommendation stack is not just a retrieval. There's like a lot that goes before it and a lot that goes after it to really get the results that you need. And this is one of the main discussions that I have with larger companies that I work with, that, I tell them, hey, this is going to be able to do amazing things, but it's not magic. I mean, you're not going to just hook it up and everything's going to be perfect. This is work. We're going to have scientists and engineers work on this thing for multiple quarters, and we're going to learn and iterate and improve and add stuff and remove stuff, and we'll get there. Eventually, we'll be able to do Q&A incredibly well, and chat support and legal discovery and all that stuff. It is possible because we've been building these things for years now, and we know it's possible. We also know it's not trivial. Like, and every use case is slightly different, and every application has different preferences and different comfort zones on the ratio between speed and cost and accuracy and format and length of the input and the output and like freshness of the data and like you name it. You just really have to build a whole solution around it, and that takes time.
And I imagine, one thing that must be interesting for you as a business is, and I've heard this from other folks that sell AI tools in enterprises, is you kind of land in, and I'm sure they're like, oh, this is amazing. We have, Edo and this awesome Pinecone team, like build out our Q&A, product for us or something. And they're so excited to have you there. And obviously, I think at scale, you certainly want to be empowering the developers in these companies to, to build these things and to tweak things themselves. Like, how have you thought about, where you're just, hey, it's the early days of this space, like we might as well just come in and help them tune the knobs and make this implementation work, versus, hey, we really want to, we're kind of going to be a little more religious about them just, playing around with the different things that Pinecone has to offer.
So for the first 3 years of the company's existence, my board was very unhappy with me because we were almost religiously not doing that. Like, we would get questions and we would, whatever, everything that we understood was needed, we either documented very clearly that we don't do, or we made it very, very easy or maybe completely transparent and Pinecone, just completely something you don't have to do at all, or something that we don't do at all. Like, either we take care of it 100% or we would do 0% of it, right? And then we were very explicit about that, right? We had to oftentimes have very uncomfortable conversations with potentially large customers that need help with XYZ, and we know how to do XYZ, and we tell them, no, we can't help you because we're really busy building a vector database. But that really panned out in the growth phase of the company, where you really started having literally thousands of customers who not only don't like seek our help, they're not willing to meet with us. They're just happy and successful, and they don't want to waste their time. It's like, hey, this shit works. I have better things to do. I don't need to talk to you guys. I'm like, okay. And so my sales team is agonizing about, it's like, hey, like, this is whatever. We need to speak with them. We don't know who they are. I'm like, I know, but they don't want to talk to us. What do you want to do?
For the folks that like, maybe are not talking to you and can't get it to work, like, is there one like thing you wish that people tried more? Like, oh, if only you would like use a different embeddings model, or I don't know, whatever it is. Like, is there one kind of common failure mode you see for people that are trying this and can't get it to work?
Yeah. So I will say that as a company also, we've grown and evolved, and companies that do want to help, do want our help, we engage with them. We're not like a professional services team, right? We won't go and build a whole solution, but we're very, very happy to help and consult people on their journey. And we've started doing that a lot more now that we have more capacity, obviously, in the team. I think what people really get wrong is cost estimations, right? I mean, this is one of those things that just, people come to me as like, oh, we did the napkin math and like we would pay, $50,000 a month to Pinecone, and that doesn't make sense to us. I'm like, how did you compute that? And then they would tell you, and you're like, oh my God, like, you just kind of like, you just walk them through the cost calculator. It's like $500 a month. I'm like, oh, okay. Like, great. I'm really happy we had this conversation, right? So yeah, designing their AI solution, even if it could like seem like a small change, but that might make a huge difference in the cost of the infrastructure and latencies and freshness and a bunch of other stuff. And so we're very happy to help with that. People get that wrong on a regular basis. And for me, again, as a technologist, if you use the wrong embedding models, sure, your results might be slightly worse, slightly better. You can fix that. If you calculated the costs and you now don't embark on the journey because you figured it was going to be too expensive and that calculation was wrong, you've just like, you're not even building something that you should be building. And that for me is a kind of sort of more final failure mode, which is much more painful and frankly annoying because I hear about some of those things in hindsight where some really large customer would say, oh, we thought about you guys, but then like we figured we can't run this project. And then you're like, what?
On the cost side, one thing that we see across a lot of our infrastructure companies is they ship an improvement that makes the database or whatever it is much more efficient, and then people actually end up storing less, or there's less compute, or it costs customers less. My guess is with the serverless announcement that customers could potentially be paying you less than they otherwise would have because it's a totally serverless model. Like, was that something? What was it like shipping that change? And ultimately, the best thing for your customers, but potentially at the expense of some short-term revenue. Like, how did you think about kind of moving to the serverless model?
No, it's very painful for us as a company, and like for founders listening, it's a hard transition, and for investors to see your revenue kind of go up into the right in exactly the right exponent, and suddenly that thing starting to flatten out, and you tell them, hey, look, at workloads actually grow faster now, right? But revenue is impacted by the fact that our product is so much cheaper now, right? That is a complicated discussion, and that investors don't necessarily love to see that. And even though they sort of they understand it, of course, they can rationalize it, but they still emotionally react badly to it, right? My advice to founders is that kind of transition is much easier done earlier than later. And so you should really move and do that as fast as you can and take the hit as soon as possible, right? For us, we think we're leaving on the table more than half of our revenue. For some of our customers, it's going to be 70, 80, 90% reduction in cost. For extreme cases in pharma and others where the workload is super storage heavy, this could be as little as 1 or 2% of the spend. We have companies that used to pay us $100K, they now pay us $2,000 a year. Sorry, it's literally almost nothing, right? So they're very happy. I mean, our investors are not very happy about that, but at the end of the day, it's the right thing for the customer, and it's the right thing for people building solutions on top of our platform. And so if we can't fit really nicely into their own cost structure of their own products, we're not going to be a part of the stack, right? And when I think about the trajectory of the AI stack, we're really in the very first innings of that. Like every sign shows that the adoption curve is such that like we're very early adopters, trailblazers, just getting to production and so on. At the end of the day, like almost every company is going to have a vector database doing something, either small or medium or large. We're not there yet. And so, if that's where we aim, if we need to fit snugly into that cost structure for like tens of thousands of or hundreds of thousands of different workloads, we just have to do that. Even if that there's a lot of, pain in the medium term.
Well, yeah, one thing, I was struck by is you were kind of talking about how we're in the early days of, AI infrastructure. A question that every investor is always, and folks in the ecosystem are always asking is what are kind of net new categories for startups versus, natural places for incumbents to build product. Obviously, it seems like vector databases have been one of the space where there's been a lot of net new companies, yourselves as at the forefront. As you look at the other parts of AI infrastructure, like what parts do you think make sense for new players? What parts are like the existing infrastructure players going to provide well? Curious how you think about that.
Frankly, I am much more excited about the application and the solution space more than the infrastructure layer, right? I mean, for new companies, right? This is in infrastructure. There's a winner take all, phenomenon that clearly works great for us, but that also just means that where just the space for new companies is very limited, right? On the solution and application side, I think there is so much energy and so much excitement and so many different problems that can be solved in creative new ways now that I frankly think every digital native has like 20 different startups that like say now, oh, like we're the new blah with AI, right? And now they, so you have 20 startups trying to usurp some long-term player, and you have that long-term player trying to reassert themselves as an AI native solution. And at the same time, you have enterprises both buying those technologies and learning how to use them. And so it becomes like this conveyor belt of innovation from tiny startups all the way down, up to enterprises. That is just teeming with innovation and great ideas and a ton of value. So I literally see hundreds of customers, hundreds of companies a week that work with us and so on. And like each and every one of them does something unique and interesting. And you're like, holy shit, there's yet another application. Wow, there's more value. I didn't think about this. Okay, amazing. I guess so. Wow. Who would have thunk it? Right. I
mean, I know you're an infrastructure guy, but if you if you couldn't do Pinecone and were instead building an AI application, what would you build?
It's going to sound weird to you, but I just really love communication, like email and Slack and Twitter, and like I just love that kind of data. Meetings, like transcriptions and like conversations, and so there's something about human communication, written or spoken, that is I feel like just fascinating, and there's like a ton of knowledge to be extracted. It's all like super messy and exciting and complicated and very rich, and it will be something like that, whether it's medical records or emails or Jira tickets or what have you. Like, it could be something like that.
I thought you were going to say something around surfing. but communications makes sense too.
I wish there was like some, I thought we were limiting the scope to tech companies. If it was
Probably harder to build a really strong software business in surfing.
Yes, exactly.
So I was like wondering, I was imagining like embedding surfing videos or something, for technique
And
coaching.
like,
I don't know.
Yeah. You can have a tech company where I surf every day and then pretend to have worked on something in technology.
There's actually just an AI that's running the whole time you're surfing. There's an agent that's doing all the work.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is like my software company in the Maldives on.
Yeah.
I'm honestly convinced with some of Pat's hallucinations, that's what's happening on his end. I guess, also, I mean, you obviously were previously at two, interesting places. I mean, curious, like your reflection on maybe we'll go back to the most recent one in Amazon. Like, how do you kind of think they're positioned right now? What would you be building if you were still there? Obviously, you did a lot of the Sagemaker work. Any reflections on that?
Sure. I look, I mean, different companies just need to have the benefits and also like the restriction of needing to focus on different parts of the stack, right? When you run at AWS scale, if your product doesn't bring in hundreds of millions of dollars a year, it's a failed product. It doesn't actually move the needle at all, right? Startups operate in a different mode and so on. And, your horizon for innovation and your appetite for risk is different and so on. So, I don't know that Amazon, frankly, Google or Microsoft are even working on the things that, we're working on. I can tell you that we are laser focused on stuff that we know for a fact is going to be a part of the stack and a part of the solution, and is realistically going to hit the market in at least, a year and a half or two from now, because it's that early, right? In the same way that, 5 years ago, people didn't know what the hell we were saying when we said vector databases. We are now already working on the stuff that's going to hit the market in 2 or 3 years from now. So that's it. That's the most exciting thing for me, to be honest. I mean, this is where like the really cool stuff is kind of happens behind the scenes.
Yeah, one thing that I think is interesting, especially around how far in advance companies and infrastructure companies like you guys need to plan, is being able to skate to where the puck is going, and kind of predict the future in some extent, especially in a market that is moving so fast, where infrastructure is changing really, really quickly, and context windows are changing, what the models can do are changing. Are there specific kind of technologies or architectures or maybe even companies that you're watching and you're like, okay, that is going to be a really big thing in 1 year or in 2 years, or anything like that that's on your radar?
I think there's going to be a significant shift in the kinds of hardware that we use, right? What is happening now with GPUs, I think, is not sustainable. And it might still go up before it goes down, but I don't think this is what AI will look like going forward, right? So that's on hardware. We're going to have to see something change there.
And do you think that means more CPU workloads, or people adapting models to run on CPUs, or maybe it's something else?
It's going to be CPUs and GPUs and maybe specialized, spec servers that are really optimized for either training or serving, or maybe distributed infrastructure for that. I'm sure vector databases are going to play a part in that, but it's not even. I'm not even suggesting that right now. It's really just there has to be a change, just like macroeconomically. It just doesn't make sense what's happening now in terms of data pipelines and kind of data management and so on. Again, something's going to have to change. It's the tools that we had 5-10 years ago just don't cut it anymore. And both the operational headache and the actual costs and the time they have to wait and so on are just not reasonable. Something's going to have to change there. And again, finally, I think we're going to have to start seeing those moderating systems where even if you don't own the model or whatever, like you have to somehow be able to have some kind of governance and visibility and ability to control what's happening with your stack that today runs open loop for most companies. So we're going to see, I think, meaningful changes in the stack and in the software we use for it.
I'm too intrigued by what you said earlier about things you're working on that, will blow our minds in 2-3 years. All right. I don't know if we're allowed to ask, but I'll ask anyway. Any hints you can give us on some of the research directions or where things are going in your world?
I wish.
I had to shamelessly, give it a go. We'll have to just reschedule you for 18 months from now, so you can announce it with us.
I promise to share.
We can be the VCs that then are saying, "Wow, you actually did exactly what you were going to
do." Exactly. Well, we always like to end our conversations with a quick fire round where we get your thoughts on a set of common questions we ask folks. And so maybe to kick it off, would love your thoughts on one thing that's overhyped and one thing that's underhyped in AI today.
It's going to sound nuts, but I think foundational models are overhyped. We know exactly what they can and cannot do, and I don't think we're actually making a lot of progress there, to be honest, for quite a long time. Not any qualitative progress. I mean, not any significant progress. I don't know if it's underhyped, but I find code generation and coding assistance to be exceedingly useful. It's one of probably the most exciting use cases of this technology. So, underhyped.
What's been the biggest surprise in building Pinecone? Maybe something that you thought would work but didn't, or something that you didn't think was going to work that ended up working really well?
We had at some point pretty early on, I mean, not very early on, maybe a year and a half into the company, maybe 2. I might be off, but whatever, a year and a half or 2 into the life of the company, we had a complete rewrite of the entire database in Rust. Everything. From we had C and Python, Go and control plane and this, that, like a million different things. And we just rewrote everything in Rust because we figured the kind of operational issues that we were running into we're not going to be able to scale with them. I thought that was borderline suicide, and it would take us 6 months to even get to the point where we can even be on par with our existing system. And at that point, we'll be far behind. And our CTO, Ram Sriharsha, was, we're gonna complete this turnaround in a month. We're like, no way. And I was shocked. It didn't take a month. It took 2 or 3 months, but the result was so much better than what we had before. That again, rewrites, I don't know if anybody here, whatever, rewrites are always whatever. This is companies literally die because of rewrites. This was a huge bit. And oftentimes they just give you fresh and exciting new problems, oftentimes worse than the ones you started with. This was one of those as advertised rewrites. It actually did what we were supposed to do. And I was just holy shit, it actually worked.
That's awesome. I guess besides Pinecone, what other company do you think would be most interesting to build AI features at right now?
I would probably go build join either a research lab or high performance optimization company that really does sort of compiling for these models. I think the fact that the execution layer and the software for training and execution is one and the same is sort of insane. So I think there's a lot of fun engineering and science problems to be solved there.
When do you think we'll have agents that really work?
Don't they work already?
I mean, to the point where I can say, hey, AI agent, book me a trip, or something like that. I don't know. It seems like they sometimes work, but sometimes not so much.
Well, I have human assistants that they don't work all the time either.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure where you set the bar on how often they need to work. As much as we expect from humans to work, they're already doing a decent job. I mean, is it kind of, I will say that when they make a mistake, it's more embarrassing. Like it's more like it's silly because it's not a mistake a human would make. But I think just like probability of completing the task, I think we're getting close to human levels.
Awesome. Well, I feel like there's a ton of threads in this conversation that folks will want to turn on. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'll leave the last word to you. Like, where can folks go to learn more about you, about Pinecone? Feel free to point folks in any direction you want.
Look, our website's always a good place to start. There's plenty of material on how to build stuff, examples, docs, notebooks, like, reference architectures, integrations with partners, and so on. Yeah, I mean, it's always a good place to start. I will, as a meta recommendation, I would say, don't try to learn about Pinecone. Try to go build something exciting. And if that leads you to needing Pinecone, great. And if it doesn't, great. You still have, built something else that was exciting nonetheless, right? But I think, like, going back to the kind of somewhere in the middle of our conversation, the most common mode of failure is doing nothing. If you can overcome that, you've already like outdone most of the field.
Right. Then you just have to make sure you don't do the cost estimate incorrectly, right?
Yes, correctly. And then if you think you're going to pay Pinecone too much, drop us a line and we'll come talk to you.
Amazing. Well, this has been a ton of fun. Seriously, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, guys.
Well, Pat, that was a fun one.
Yeah, super fun. He's a really interesting guest, very thoughtful, and he kind of has this lens at the infrastructure level, but then they see so much by virtue of everyone building on top of Pinecone. So it was cool to hear his perspective.
Yeah, I mean, what an interesting seat. I feel like he really does see everything, right? He sees like the developers messing around with new applications. He sees the really sophisticated enterprises and what's required for them to get RAG live. I feel like it's a pretty cool position to have.
Yeah, and he's even more bullish on the applications and infrastructure, which I thought was funny.
Yeah, I thought that was that was interesting, and I loved the subtle jibe at VCs who poo-pooed vector databases and then came back in 2023 saying that had years of conviction. Nothing we would ever do, obviously.
Yeah, of course not us, but the other VCs.
Yeah. One thing that's just so interesting about this space as a whole is I feel like we've seen folks, pitching, oh, we have this sophisticated embeddings model that works really well in this context or this retrieval approach. And, it's very clear that we're still in such the early innings where it's just like folks are just trying to find ways to make things work, the basics work. And then and I mean, to Edo's point, like you just got to start building, right? And I think if you can make the basics work, I do wonder when we'll move to the chapter of maybe more sophisticated trade-offs and decisions around some of these embeddings models and approaches to retrieval. But it certainly seems like, it was interesting to hear him reiterate or reaffirm that, the case today is basically just, can you get something up and running? And he's just, it's clearly he's blown away by the stuff that folks have been able to get up and running.
He's obviously biased given where he sits as the CEO of a vector DB company, but he definitely believes that more of the intelligence will move towards the retrieval and towards that part of the stack versus purely at the kind of generation and or model stage.
I loved his like cynicism of like, what a surprise. The people that charge per token have increased the context window. I think he's the first person we've ever had on that says foundation models were overhyped. I don't know if he's not a scaling laws believer or whatnot, but it's always fun to get that's, I think what's so fun about the space is there's just, there's so many, every time we do overhyped, underhyped, there's like a different set of things. Whereas, as I run a healthcare podcast and that space is a little bit more stagnant and it's like every time the same things that are over and underhyped.
Yeah. I liked his underhyped answer too of coding assistants. And there's obviously a ton of hype around them, but I do think that is an incredible application of AI and one we're going to see a lot more of. Shout out Poolside, I guess.
Exactly. Always got to shout out the portfolio.
I thought it was interesting when he was talking about people not defaulting to OpenAI. And, that is kind of the default now, but he sees smaller models that are potentially cheaper doing just as well. I thought that was interesting. Because I think that's not really something that we see very much, where it kind of most people seem to start with OpenAI or maybe Mistral, whatever, and then go from there.
Totally. I mean, I think he's laser focused on the economics of these use cases. And, if I'm being honest, I think a lot of what we see today is still focused in like this exploration mode where it's like, well, what can you do with these models? And it's like, you might as well start with OpenAI because if you can't do it with that, you're not going to be able to do it with too much more, maybe a smaller fine-tuned model. But I think that, it'll be interesting to see. One thing I'm super curious to see is just, will folks end up in this kind of optimization phase as they deploy this at scale? Probably. But at the same time, right when you're ready to optimize, GPT-5 comes out or the next model comes out, and it's like you're probably right back to just exploring again, like what are the capabilities that you can do with these models? And so I do wonder, I'm sure we'll see plenty of cost optimization, but this exploration phase, I think, is going to be continuous.
Yeah, he seemed a little bit more bearish on scale than I think some other folks in the ecosystem, where we hear a lot of bigger, more GPUs, bigger models, all of this. And, his take was it's not sustainable and the pendulum may swing back towards, CPUs and specialized hardware and potentially specialized models and smaller models. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, Pat, that was another fun one. Folks should definitely stay tuned and subscribe. We are always trying to get the word out. Share with a friend that you think might enjoy this, and stay tuned next week for another great AI founder.